Hello everyone, my name is Anj, and in today's video we'll be talking all about price discrimination. And what price discrimination is when the same company charges different prices to different people for the same product in order to try and maximize profits. And there are a few different ways in which this can be achieved, and there are many examples in the world today which you might not be particularly aware of, where price discrimination does occur, or you may not have even thought of them as price discrimination because you would not have realized that actually this counts as price discrimination. So in today's video we're going to look at the terms of price discrimination, what exactly are the different types of price discrimination, such as you can see up here on the board. We've got first, second and third degree. We're going to go through what those are. We're going to look at the conditions required for price discrimination to be possible, why it can sometimes be difficult to achieve, and we're also going to look at some graphs and see how it affects the producer and consumer surplus. And for the purposes of this video, it's not essential, but it would help to know about consumer producer surplus, for which you can refer to my other video which is titled Consumer and Producer Surplus. So starting off with first degree price discrimination. First degree price discrimination, also more commonly actually referred to as perfect price discrimination and rarely also referred to as pure price discrimination, is when the firm charges the maximum possible price to each customer. What this is that every different customer receives a different amount of benefit from the same product. They need it or want it more than other people, more or less than other people, and hence they all have a different willingness to pay. So depending on things such as their financial situation and also their need for the product, they will be willing to pay different amounts. And what first degree price discrimination does, or what companies using this do, is they charge that exact price that they are willing to pay, and that's the maximum possible price that they are willing to pay, hence taking all of the consumer surplus for themselves. The consumer surplus is the extra benefit that the consumer would receive, and this occurs when they're willing to pay more than they actually have to end up paying. But with pure price discrimination, this would not occur because the firm would charge exactly the maximum that they would be willing to pay. And hence, the firm maximizes profits by capturing all the available consumer surplus and making it producer surplus, which is extra benefits for the sellers. Now moving on to second degree price discrimination. Second degree price discrimination is essentially charging different amounts for different quantities purchased. For example, depending on the quantity, they can charge different amounts to different people who are buying those different quantities. For example, there could be discounts on bulk purchases. If they're selling them to wholesalers and they're selling much more of them to wholesalers, they might decrease the price per unit, and hence say they were going to sell it at $79.99 to retail stores per unit. For wholesalers, in this case taking the example of a wholesaler who buys more of the product, they might sell them for $74.99 each, hence £5 less per unit. And also this can apply to if they're selling them to customers individually. For example, if the customer is buying 5 units, it could be buy 4 and get a fifth free, for example, and this would be a discount for the customer due to bulk purchases. It also applies to loyalty cards, memberships and two-part tariffs. Loyalty cards, such as people who are buying more quantity, visiting more frequently and buying things from the company more often, might get discounts because they purchase higher quantity. With memberships, the same thing applies. They get discounts because they come more often, but they have to pay an upfront cost, which is what a two-part tariff essentially is. You have to pay a lump sum fee upfront, which is just a larger sum upfront, and then you have to pay per unit fees after as well. So payments bit by bit depending on how much you use the product. And memberships and two-part tariffs are also an example of second degree price discrimination, since for these people who have the memberships, they have to pay less per unit after they've paid the upfront cost for the membership, and hence they get the discounts. And you may be wondering that if they're getting the discounts, it might not be as good for the company, but it is good for the company. One, because they're getting money from the larger upfront cost, and also memberships would lead the consumers who would actually come frequently to quite possibly come much more frequently than they otherwise would, because they don't have a membership. It's cheaper for them to go to this place as opposed to any other place, so they would come even more often, which would help increase the revenue for the company. Furthermore, there's also third-degree price discrimination, which is discriminating based on the price in the terms of charging different prices to different consumer groups as a whole. For example, for movies, seniors and adults and children, and the same thing applies to zoos and many other places where they divide them into age categories. And the reason why often adults have higher prices charged for them is because they have a less elastic demand. Their demand's quite inelastic since they often have an income and they can probably afford to go to the movies, for example, more than children would be able to. In terms of children or students are more sensitive to the price changing. For example, if it got too expensive, they might not be able to afford going to the cinema with their pocket money, or their parents might not allow them to go to the cinema because it's too expensive. However, the adults would have, on average, a less elastic demand than the children. They're less sensitive to the price change than the children. If, say, it was the same price for both adults and children and it went up by £1, the children would probably more children would probably not go to the cinema because they can't afford it. They find it too expensive, whereas the adults are less likely, as a whole, to find it too expensive. There's also a third-degree price discrimination is also in terms of peak and off-peak times, such as for parking, you have to pay more at the peak times, and sometimes you have to pay less or not at all at the off-peak times. And same applies to restaurants, who usually use this to manage overcrowding. They'll charge less to people coming at off-peak times and charge more to people coming at peak times. And the reason why first-degree price discrimination is actually quite rare, and it rarely occurs, and it's rarely practiced. And the reason for this is, one, it's very hard to immediately determine exactly what the maximum the consumer is willing to pay is. What is the maximum that the consumer is willing to pay? And secondly, if there was good competition, then in reality the person would just go to one of the substitutes. Say it's a stationery shop, it could just go to another stationery shop and buy the same products for cheaper. Another example of third-degree price discrimination is Microsoft Office for students and Microsoft Office for just regular users, and students get a discount in this case because of their more elastic demand. One way that price discrimination is practiced is by firms offering slightly different variations of the same product, making them very similar products, but makes it easier for them to charge different prices for them, since different groups of consumers will be willing to pay different amounts and they can charge different prices for those similar products. So to explain this further, there's many examples where they can create variations, such as organic products, free-range eggs, and normal eggs. So obviously the people who are willing to pay that little bit more would be more likely to go for the free-range eggs, and hence by supplying both free-range eggs and normal eggs, it can separate the two groups of consumers, the one that are trying to go for the cheapest possible, not regarding the quality as much, and who would just buy the normal eggs, and the other group who would buy the free-range eggs, and through that they're actually charging two different prices and getting slightly more from the free-range eggs, hence increasing their revenue. Another example is extra legroom on planes, first and second class seating, business class, economy class, and those separate the different groups of consumers who are willing to pay different amounts. And now we're moving on to the legalities of price discrimination. And is it legal? Well, it's not legal on the basis of gender, race, and nationality. In the US, these are the rules applying to the US. These are only justified if you can prove that it takes more effort to produce a certain product for a certain gender, then only you can charge more for it. For example, you can't charge more or less for women's or men's haircuts, and you can't charge more or less for women's and men's clothing to be dry cleaned. But the only way you could do this is if you've justified that it's harder to do so. For example, if the woman's clothing is often more elaborate and has fabric that's, for example, I'm pretty much making this up here, but fabric that would be harder to dry clean, and whatever the conditions. But if you can justify this, then only you would be allowed to discriminate on the price on the basis of gender, and pretty much never on race and nationality, because you can't justify that it would take more or less effort to produce products for different races or nationalities, other than perhaps hair, because different races often have different types of hair which could be harder or easier to cut or to style. That would be much harder to be justified, but an easier way they could discriminate on the price on this basis is the type of, they could just discriminate on the price on the basis of the type of haircut, and if it's harder hair to deal with, it could be just a harder haircut, and hence they could charge more money. Here are the main conditions required for price discrimination to be possible. First of all, the different consumer groups must have different price elasticities of demand, and what this essentially is, just to make a long story short, is that they must have different price sensitivities. And this means that, as we've covered just slightly earlier in this video, if they're more sensitive to price change, which would mean they're more likely to not buy the product or the service if the price goes up too much, then you charge them a lower price, and the groups with a more inelastic demand you charge a higher price to, such as adults, because they're less sensitive to the price change. And if you want more information on this, you can refer to my video titled Elasticity. Also, there must be a slight level of price making power, as what it essentially means is that there must be a slightly imperfect competition. And if there was a perfect competition, then the firm would just have to accept the market price and what every other company is charging, and they would have to charge that amount of money. For example, if the product, the cost of a certain type of shirt for the same shirt was £50 in another shop that was easily accessible, people would just shift to buying from the other shop in a perfect competition if they increase the price from £50 to £60. So there must be a slightly imperfect competition where they can change the price slightly and people will still buy from their shop, not from the other shop, or buy from that company, I should say. So this is what I mean by price making power. Such an imperfect competition occurs when there's not proper data dissemination and not everyone has access to the same information. There must also be low implementation costs. For example, if the firm needs a lot more labor and needs to pay them to implement this price discrimination, then it would also almost be useless, especially if it costs them more than it's actually helping them in terms of the increase in revenue. If they're having to pay the new employees more than they're earning through actually implementing the price discrimination, then it would be useless and actually detrimental. And they also must be able to separate the consumer groups, otherwise it would be a flawed price discrimination. Adults may end up using child tickets just to get a cheaper price. So you need to be able to successfully separate the consumer groups. Some advantages of price discrimination, which we're now going to cover, include increased revenue, managing demand, and lower prices for some. So we'll just briefly go through each of these. So first of all, increased revenue. Obviously, if they're charging different prices for different consumer groups, then for the consumer groups which they're charging higher prices for than they otherwise would, then they would be increasing their revenue since they're generating more money, as a certain percentage of their customers are paying more than they otherwise would. And also it manages demand with regards to off-peak and peak times, which is an example, as we looked at previously, of third degree price discrimination. Taking the example of a restaurant, if someone's coming at off-peak times, then they would be charged less, and this manages demand because then there's more incentive to go at off-peak times. For example, a 5 o'clock dinner is relatively early, but since there's less charges for 5 o'clock dinners, there's like happy hours for some restaurants or special offers at certain hours, which give incentive for consumers to eat at the restaurant earlier on during the off-peak times when it's not as crowded, so that less people are in the restaurants at the peak times and there's less rush, and hence they charge the normal prices in the peak times and certain discounts at off-peak times. And this also applies to parking, for example, just to manage demand. And lower prices for some is obviously if you're separating them into groups with different price elasticities of demand. The groups with lower price elasticities of demand, you would end up charging them less. Furthermore, to do with the increased revenue, if the company has increased revenue, it could also lead to their growth. They could reinvest their profits back into the business, and with that investment, it could help the business grow. And furthermore, it could actually lead to the business's survival. Say if without price discrimination, the business wasn't going to earn enough revenue to cover up for its total costs, but with price discrimination, with the increased revenue, it can. And now we're going to look at some disadvantages. So for disadvantages, it could be potentially unfair. For example, some senior citizens could be very well off, whereas some adults may not be as well off and might be unemployed, for example, and they would actually have hence a higher elasticity of demand, but they're still being charged more. There are some firms where there's only discounts for new customers, whereas there's no such loyalty discounts for existing customers, and no memberships as such either. And then there's also a decline in the consumer surplus, since more of the consumer surplus is being taken away since higher prices are being charged, and more of that consumer surplus becomes producer surplus. And this can be seen as a bad thing, as since we looked in my consumer and producer surplus video, is since if people are getting a good deal, which they are with consumer surplus, then they're likely to spend more, which boosts production and helps the economy grow. Whereas if there's little incentive, little extra good deal that they're getting, and there's no extra benefit that they're getting, then they're less likely to feel encouraged or excited as such, which that is a factor when you're buying goods generally. Then they're less likely to buy the same amount of goods. They might buy less goods than they otherwise would, and hence there would be less production and the economy would not grow. And there could be higher prices for some, such as the inelastic demand groups, and also there's a potentially high cost of implementation. For example, if there's a lot of labor required to run it and to make sure that you can separate the different groups and make sure they don't overlap and no person from one group takes the advantages or disadvantages of the other group, and there's no seepage between the groups, then that could cost more than it's actually helping your revenue, and in that case it would be a bad thing. It would be a disadvantage of price discrimination. It could also lead to predatory pricing. It's unlikely, but what predatory pricing is when the firm tries to price their products really low to drive out competition, and they may also engage in unethical production methods or abnormal production methods, not the same as what everyone else is doing in their business. And this could be because this method of production has a low marginal cost of each incremental unit, and then they can produce it for less and sell it for less, driving out all the competition, and they try to make a monopoly in the market where there's no competition, and then they can set the prices as high as they want. However, this is against many antitrust laws, which are essentially laws that apply to virtually every industry and all levels of business. And we're just going to quickly look at different types of price discrimination on a graph. So with third degree price discrimination, or the most common type of price discrimination, assuming we have price on this axis and quantity on this axis, then what we can see is that if they're charging different prices, let's say this lower price, P1, we'll call it, and then this middle price is P2, and then this price is P3. Let's say this is for adults, this is for seniors, and this is for children. We're assuming in this case that the first, around 1,000 units would be bought by adults, 2,000, the next 1,000 by seniors, and the next 1,000 by children. However, there would be some overlap, but we can look at it for the purposes of this example, and we can see that there would be an increased producer surplus, since they're eating into the consumer surplus by charging the different prices for those who are willing to pay more. And we looked at the fact that the producer surplus is the area above what the minimum that the producers were willing to supply for, so the supply curve, and below the price line. And hence, I'll do it in red. This is for the first price, producer surplus. This is for the second price, and this is for the third price. And this area here is the producer surplus, and hence this remaining area here is the consumer surplus. I'm just shading it in green. And we'll look at first degree price discrimination. Well, essentially what it is the price line is the demand curve, as you're pricing the product at all the way along this demand curve at the maximum the consumer is willing to pay based on the benefit that they get. So this is again price, this is quantity. And then you would produce up to here at the market equilibrium, where it's priced most efficiently. And then what you get is that all this space is eaten up by the producer surplus actually. All this price is the producer surplus. And there is no consumer surplus left in perfect price discrimination. Just a few brief points to end on with regards to wholesalers and manufacturers. For wholesalers and manufacturers, it's quite hard to identify price discrimination since most transactions occur privately. So what some purchasers do is they place certain clauses on their contracts that agree with the wholesaler or manufacturer that they must give a guarantee that they're pricing their products at the same price, or they're selling their products to them at the same price as they are to all their other customers. Furthermore, if the purchaser is a very large purchaser and has a big bargaining power, sometimes what they can do is they can agree with the firm that if they later on lower the price and start selling to other firms for a lower price, they will refund the difference to the purchaser. Furthermore, with regards to revenue, it makes sense for the producer, obviously, to produce up until the points where their revenue is equal to their costs, because as soon as their costs exceed their revenue, then it wouldn't make any sense to produce that much, and that's what we looked at with regards to the implementation costs. And if the costs are becoming more than the revenue, then it's not good for the business. And this is what we will be focusing more on in one of the upcoming videos, which will be focusing mainly on marginal revenue and marginal cost, and will be titled something along the lines of those. So if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and leave any comments if you want to ask any question, or if you have anything to say about the video. And please watch as many of my other videos as you can, because I hope you will enjoy them as well if you have enjoyed this one, as they discuss many economic concepts and investing concepts, and also mathematics concepts or mathematics problems, I should say, in my other channel, which is called Engineering Mathematics. So hope you enjoyed.